Thank you very much to Allison and to the Autism Science Foundation. It's a pleasure to be here. And I know this topic is one close to many people's heart, both as a place for hope and opportunity, and I do think there really are some great possibilities. So what do we know about cannabis, which is the original name? Marijuana was actually introduced by the federal government to be a negative connotation term in the 1930s, so I tend to prefer cannabis, although marijuana at this point is the more common term. So what is cannabis? And I think it's important to think about it in its natural environment and how it's been adapted by human beings, and then finally, what the potential or known medical benefits are. So I'm going to take you briefly through a little tour of cannabis and give you some background about it. So cannabis is mainly two species. Many of us have heard of these in different ways. Cannabis sativa is the one we know historically for the longest period of time, well over 10,000 years. It arose in China, or those are the first documented references to it and knowledge about it. And then there's cannabis indica, which interestingly, although was first written about and probably bred thousands of years later in India, that is the form of cannabis that first made it to Europe through Britain, which had a colony or had a representation in India and imported it, and through that in the United States. And it has been said in the 1800s that the most common treatment for pain in the United Kingdom was actually cannabis indica. And it was used very widely. It was used to treat epilepsy by some of the great original professors and founders of British neurology, and it was used on the continent and in the United States as well. Now, those two species have been so thoroughly interbred in the United States in the last 50 years, it is really difficult to get a genetic signature. But people will talk about, oh yeah, I've got pure sativa, we got seeds from the 60s, and take those things with a grain of cannabis. So what do we know about cannabis? It's an extraordinarily complex plant. There are at least 540 compounds that have been isolated from these two species, grown in different environments and in different ways. So we're used to, in medicine, typically taking a single compound, a single drug, whatever that may be, and testing it in a population and giving some a placebo and some the drug. With plant-based cannabis derivatives, it's complex. We know, and I'll talk about the two most common ingredients, which are the ones that are in medicinal products most frequently, but keep in mind there are many more, especially in states like New York and New Jersey, where people through the state medical marijuana program, through the Department of Health, are getting plant-based products. So it's not the cannabidiol that I used, which was 99% CBD, and essentially a pure single drug. It's really a complex mixture of two compounds plus many others. THC, or tetrahydrocannabinol, is the quote-unquote psychoactive ingredient in cannabis. It is the part that gives people the high or the euphoria or the munchies, depending on which way you look at it. And it binds, it's actually the one we know really well and has been studied for many years. Raphael Mechoulam, a scientist at Hebrew University, it's a great story. He wrote to the NIH back in the early 60s, said, I'd really like to study this cannabis and see what makes people get the psychoactive property. And they wrote back and said, we don't really think many people in the United States are using cannabis, so we're not going to fund this. It's actually at his apartment in Jerusalem about 12 days ago, and he's telling me the story. He said, so then about a year later, they called me up and they said, a senator, he called the NIH, and he's very urgent. His son, he said, is a pothead, and he wants to know if it's killing brain cells or not. So they funded me, and they funded me for 40 more years. And with that, they actually did discover, he did, that THC is the active ingredient. Cannabidiol is another major constituent which works in a totally separate system, which we're first learning about now. He also synthesized both of those, and remarkably in 1972, using CBD that he synthesized, he did a small study in epilepsy which was actually positive. It was an underpowered study and had some methodological issues, so really never got picked up in a big way, but I'm happy to have been the person who picked up that baton about 40 years later. As you can see, we have some suspicion of where cannabidiol works. That GPR55 receptor seems to be one we're focusing on a lot in epilepsy, but likely it's more complex. And this next slide is from a review article I did with my colleague Dan Friedman in the New England Journal about 3 or 4 years ago. And the point is, things are always more complicated than they seem. We often in medicine like to make things clean and simple. We're giving you a drug that blocks dopamine receptors, but the doctor may not tell you it actually works on serotonin, norepinephrine, and a bunch of other receptors at different concentrations. This slide's a busy one, but the point is, even for the one like THC, where we know the main effect in the brain is on the CB1 receptor, it binds to a site that our brain makes 2 compounds that stimulate, just like opiates come from a plant, and they bind to the opiate receptor in our brains. Our brains have CB1 receptors, and we make a couple of compounds naturally that bind to those receptors. It's part of our biology. And the same is going to be true for CBD, and the last compound here is cannabidivarin, and that is a compound present in cannabis that I will actually be working with Eric Hollander at Montefiore doing a study specifically in autism on CBDV, and we hope that will actually get started shortly. So one of my passions is evolution. There's a famous statement by Devinsky that nothing in biology makes sense except in light of evolution. And so we need to think about cannabis because people, as I'll get to, will talk about it in different ways. And I think we need to see it from the perspective of cannabis. So it's been around for about 15 million years as best we can estimate. Hops, which is used to make beer, is in the same family and has, if you smell it, has some of the same odors from some similar compounds that are present in both plants. But why would a plant have so many compounds? And the answer is relatively simple. Now, we don't know exactly what THC and CBD and many of the other terpenes and cannabinoids are doing biologically for the plant, but they're there for the plant's benefit, not for ours. And specifically, we know that these types of compounds prevent desiccation, help prevent bacterial or fungal or viral parasites, beetles, a variety of other parasites, and that's why these compounds are there. And I'll get to that because there's a strong belief that in treating something, whether it's epilepsy or autism or pain, that nature knows best, and nature put all these things together for us to make medicines out of them. But I would say that's wishful thinking at best. It may be true, but more likely it is not. So what do we know about the domestication? A moderate amount. We know of it from historical writings. We know it was used to treat epilepsy over 4,000 years ago in the Middle East and Persia. But it began in Central Asia, in China. It was probably first used for rope and fiber products, and then quickly diversified, as we know, into religious uses, medicinal uses, and recreational uses, and probably all 3 of those were mixed together as they have been for human history for many products. And an important concept in thinking about cannabis, because this comes up in my practice so much. I mainly treat people with epilepsy, but as I know at least a dozen families here, I also treat a large number of people with autism, that people are naturally attracted to natural things. But from an evolutionary perspective, it's always worth asking about what is natural and what's not. Cannabis that you get from New York or New Jersey or Colorado or California, wherever your state of choice is, has been very heavily interbred to obtain high CBD, high THC, other compounds like CBN. Different people breed it for what they want. But there is no natural cannabis anymore. So this is a picture of an English bulldog about 100 years ago and a modern one. And some of you may know that the modern ones, number 1, can't have sex, and number 2, can't be born. They have to be born by cesarean section. So we have routinely bred organisms, whether they be dogs or plants, to highly unnatural states. The next picture is one that, again, many of us know from biology textbook, but teosinte is the ancient American ancestor of what we now know as corn. And it took many thousands of years to produce what everybody now sees as corn. So people, think of corn as a natural product. It's not natural. There's nothing natural about corn. It's gone through artificial selection by human beings for thousands of years. Now that's not bad. It's clearly been very helpful for feeding many populations. I enjoy corn. I have nothing against it. But we just need to take the perspective, like cannabis, it's not what nature produced. It's now something that's very much under human control, just like the English bulldog. So when we think about natural things, we're not terribly natural too from the standard definitions. If you look at humans, we're a family for 3 million years, the Homo family. We are a species, Homo sapiens sapien, for about 200,000 years with all, as best we can tell, modern features. If anything, our brain has shrunk in the last 50, 100,000 years. But even in the last 12,000 years, where we have incredibly good fossil evidence and good imputation of genetic data, our skulls are much thinner, our jaws are much smaller. Did anyone ever wonder what people did with wisdom teeth 200 years ago? Or 5,000 years ago in Roman times? They didn't have a problem because children chewed hard things. And when children chew hard things, their jaws grow to the size that human jaws were supposed to grow. And in the last 200 years, with the enormous institution of processed soft foods beginning very early in life, we don't chew so much. So we have small jaws. And we end up with a mismatch disease where our molars grow in adolescence, and there's no room for them. And so we take them out with a dentist and we get rid of the problem. But that's how we've adapted our bodies to the current situation. And it's an incredibly, incredibly unnatural way to do it. Milk tolerance evolved in multiple different groups in Northern Europe, in Africa, Bedouin populations, for groups that had cows and goats, and obviously the ability to drink their milk was very advantageous. But again, we've been mammals, our family of mammals, for 200 million years, give or take. It's in the last 5,000 years that one species began to consume milk post-weaning. It's a relatively remarkable thing, but it's part of our biology now, and many of us, including myself, are milk tolerant. It's just not a natural condition for mammals for 200 million years. But it's part of us, and we just have to accept that this is what evolution does. And then many of the genes that are bad for us have actually probably been adaptations to infectious diseases, whether it be cystic fibrosis, sickle cell anemia for malaria. But many of the adaptations that we have that now cause human diseases were very protective for infections that were rampant in our ancestors' times. And as I said, on the flip coin of that, we have been adapted to be good at eating when we get food and storing it. And obesity is essentially absent from every hunter-gatherer and rural population that's isolated from Western foods. It doesn't exist. Diabetes, it doesn't exist. Albert Schweitzer was in Western Africa for 20 years and saw 20 to 30,000 people and didn't see cancer or diabetes. These are not the natural, they do occur in these populations, but they're exceedingly rare. So our environment, our world, has also impacted on our body, not just our wisdom teeth, but in many ways, to be very unnatural. So I give this as a little bit of an introduction because we think of things that are natural as good, and that's the message here. They may be good, but they may be bad. This is a fugu, a puffer fish, which is, many people know, is an exquisite delicacy in sushi restaurants, but you need to know your chef well, because 1 microgram of tetrodotoxin, which this fish has and many other natural organisms have, will kill you. So poison ivy, sharks, pufferfish, there are a lot of things that are natural that are not so good. And I know in today's world we worry a lot about genetically modified organisms. I would say they're probably the safest thing in the world. A book was written about the population bomb in the 1960s that predicted India is going to go through famines, mass starvation, and huge deaths. When that book hit the printing press through genetically modified rice and wheat, India was exporting food. There were no deaths due to famine in India, and that was due to genetically modified organisms. What's the flip side of that? It saved millions, if not billions, of pounds of insecticides being dropped on our planet, which I would argue is phenomenally worse than putting a gene into a wheat plant that prevents it from getting parasitized by a fungus that can cause human disease. So again, the concept of natural is great, and I think people are attracted to cannabis because it's natural, but we really, in science, the goal is to be blind and be objective and not come in with a set view beforehand. So this is one of my little pet peeves in the cannabis area, and it comes up all the time that, number one, you can't just do CBD, doc, because everybody knows you need CBD with the THC to get the benefit for epilepsy or autism, and that may be right. I don't know. I don't claim to know the answer to that question. But I can tell you, science doesn't have the answer. And so this effect was actually discovered by Meshulam and his colleagues, Ben Shabbat, back about 20 years ago. And 2-AG is one of the natural cannabinoids in our brain. And it binds to that CB1 receptor and acts like THC. And what Meshulam and his colleagues found is that there are two esters of 2-AG present in the brain that in themselves, if you put them in a cell culture or an animal, they don't bind to that receptor. They have no effect at all. But in the presence of THC, or 2-AG in this case, those esters phenomenally magnify the effect of the 2-AG. And he called that the entourage effect, because when they're all present together, you get this huge synergistic effect that you would never see with those esters alone. And that makes perfect sense. And that is what he referred to, it's a great term, before the TV show, he called it the entourage effect. But many people have taken that as evidence that CBD and THC clearly need to work together. And as I said, the evolution of cannabis, the plant did not put these compounds together to treat epilepsy or autism or any other human or animal disease that I can imagine. It may happen to work, and it may not. It did it for its plant's fitness. But if you look, there are websites now, and I just picked this well-reputable one, Your Brain on Bliss. New research confirms what has long been thought. CBD, in addition to other entourage cannabinoids, is far superior medically to pure CBD. And this is a very prevalent viewpoint in the lay population that is just unfounded. Hard to give it a more generous term than that. So I want to turn now to where we do have some evidence. And the data now in epilepsy for two specific forms of epilepsy, Dravet syndrome and Lennox-Gastaut syndrome, is fairly convincing. Now, as many people here know, autism by age 30 will affect at least 25% of individuals on the autistic spectrum. And the greater the intellectual disability, females probably are more likely to have seizures and more likely to have more difficult to control seizures. But it's a significant problem in autism, and sadly, it is probably the most common cause of death among young adults and children with autism are single seizures, or what we refer to as sudden unexpected death in epilepsy. So CBD, there are now 3 publications, 2 in New England Journal, second one will hopefully come out within a month or so, and 1 in The Lancet that show about a 25% median reduction in convulsive seizures over placebo. Statistically, highly significant, not a miracle. 25% reduction is nice, and within that, 5% or so have a phenomenally wonderful response, but a very substantial number have no response or may even get a little worse, and the average person gets better, but not phenomenally so. So keep in mind, for epilepsy, where we by far have the most data, and I'm going to actually next Thursday, I will be in Silver Spring at the FDA. Hopefully, this drug will get approved for epilepsy. It's going to be a short meeting, which is actually very optimistic. The FDA had no huge concerns. So I think it's likely Epidiolex, which is 99% CBD, within the next 6 months to 12 months will be in pharmacies for people who meet the criteria. I think it needs to be studied in many more disorders, including autism, and hopefully that will be underway shortly. So what can we say about medical marijuana For autism, there's clearly a huge need. This product is now available to the majority of the US population. It's approved in 29 states and the District of Columbia. And people, depending on the state, can qualify for different indications. New Jersey, where I practice, has just liberalized some of the indications, so more people will have access to it. Most sites don't have autism, although many people with autism are able to get it through the state programs. And there are variable products. This is a huge issue in many of the states. It's hard for families to get a consistent strain or product with the milligram percents. And in medicine, people go crazy going from brand name to generic. Imagine we just shifted concentrations of what's in your drug every few months. And this unfortunately happens to many people I take care of. I've treated at least 200 people through the CBD program through GW Pharma, but I have also treated probably more likely 400 people through New York and New Jersey state medical marijuana programs. So I have a fair amount of experience, but have precious little science as far as what goes on. And I think there is a lot of opportunity. I think THC may be a particularly effective drug to treat aggressive, irritable outbursts among people with autism. And I know families that I trust, and the parents are great, have used it in that setting, essentially like a rescue medication. In epilepsy, we think a lot about this concept of rescue medicine. Some child has a 10-minute seizure, we need to stop it. We don't want to be able to take them into the hospital, we want to stop it quickly. So we have Valium-like drugs that we can give rectally, intranasally, sometimes orally, that can be rapidly absorbed and shut a seizure off within minutes, typically. And for many people with autism, I think this is an indication that needs to get explored, because many individuals I take care of with autism, and you can see it and everybody knows it, there can be tantrums, behavioral outbursts, self-injurious behavior, environmentally or externally driven aggressive behavior, and all of those may be something that could be treated with cannabis. And my experience suggests it's worth trying, because there's a lot of strong parental people who are really good observers that have used it and consistently found it works well. And from my interviews and experience with treating these individuals, probably THC works better in that setting. I think CBD may turn out to be a bit better in treating things like anxiety on a daily basis, although quite possibly the combination could be quite effective. We just don't know. But what I will say is, without controlled trials, we're dead in the water. We can't progress, because there have been so many times that really smart doctors at the best medical schools have absolutely been convinced of what's right and wrong, and they have been absolutely wrong. I mean, I could just spend an hour and give you examples off the top of my head. Professors, when I was at medical school at Harvard, who were the most revered cardiologists in the country, they were just dead wrong. 5 years later, everything they said, which they just assumed it was part of the common knowledge, like, human beings on average have 2 eyes, that, beta blockers were the most safe and effective drug for hypertension. They were wrong. Double-blind studies were done. They were all wrong. You can never, ever, ever be humble enough. And people, Steve McQueen said Laetrile cured his cancer, and many other people did too. He testified to Congress. He died 6 months later of cancer. When the double-blind study was done and published in the New England Journal of Medicine, it was completely useless. And worse than that, it actually hurt people, because there's some cyanide in the apricot seeds that Laetrile is derived from. So what's the data on CBD or THC in autism? There are some mouse studies, some of which have found some positive findings, but translating mouse to human autism has been a very bad area. There are a lot of companies that have spent many millions of dollars of mGlu-R5 drugs that completely failed based on beautiful animal experiments. They just don't work in humans. So there are some clinical studies. Zynerba is a company that took a synthetic CBD patch, which is a very good way to deliver CBD. It's fat soluble. It was a small sample, but they showed a remarkably statistically significant improvement in social avoidance, temper tantrums, repetitive movements, and hyperactivity. It was a small study, but that's the kind of, for me, anecdotal small study that justifies doing a larger study and getting really rigorous scientific data. The amount of anecdotal data is unlimited, and there are many people. You can go on the internet or talk groups, and you'll get as much as you want. But the clinical studies, and there are some underway in autism, are just getting going. And I know one at NYU we plan to do with CBD, the CBDV study we're going to do in conjunction with Montefiore. Greg Barnes in Tennessee is doing a study with Epidiolex. So there are studies underway, but we just really don't have any signal right now. And before I gave this talk, I just went on 2 sites, PubMed, which is the National Library of Medicine. It's a great site to just type in a keyword and get scientific articles quickly. So if you look at CBD and autism, there are 2 citations on PubMed. If you look at THC and autism, there are 2 citations. I think at least one of them is the same paper, actually. If you just type in autism in PubMed, you get about 42,000. So the ratio on PubMed of papers on autism to papers on autism in a cannabis product is about 10,000 to 1. If you go on Google and you look at autism and CBD, you get about 430,000 hits, significantly more than 2. If you look at autism and CBD, it's a little less. And if you just look at autism, it's about 121 million. So the ratio is about 150 to 1. So in the lay, press of information that's out there, there's a huge amount more on cannabinoids and autism than exists anywhere. And you can see the scientific literature is close to nil at this point. So this slide, the left is a very beautiful, clean highway. The bottom is a nice, pristine laboratory. And I think that's how we see science. We see science as this very beautiful road where smart people lay down a foundation, map a path, and it's fairly straightforward and clean, and it's done in these wonderful laboratories. I would argue that science looks much more like the road on the right, because 99% of science is littered with observations and anecdotes and things we thought were correct that 5 years or 10 years or 50 years later, we found out was garbage. And that's just the way it works. That's the nature of science. And therapies like leeches, which were the standard of care only 150 years ago in Western Europe and the United States, are now considered somewhat barbaric. But people still use them, of course. So I think where we need to go at this point is we need to get scientific data. We need to think about different trials of different cannabinoid products in autism. I do think there's enough signal out there from animal studies, and especially now very large anecdotal human data, which is partly what drove me to get into the autism, into the epilepsy and cannabinoid research area, and then to look at various combinations of alone versus in combination. There is, I believe, tremendous promise here. It could turn out to be one of the most effective treatments, and as everyone in this room knows, there are no terribly effective treatments. 2 drugs that are approved all have side effects, and many have long-term side effects that are probably worse than the side effects associated with cannabis. So I think I will leave you with hope, but mainly I'll leave you with the need for a lot more information. Thank you all.